Good morning, and I welcome everyone to the 32nd meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. Please ensure all mobile phones are on silent. Just a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. Before we start, I'd like to welcome Gordon MacDonald to the meeting. Gordon has replaced Gail Ross. On behalf of all the committee members, I'd like to thank Gail for all her work and wish her well on her appointment to the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee. Gordon declared he had no relevant interest in his first appearance as a committee substitute last week, but I believe he has something he would like to add this week. So could I ask Gordon to update his relevant interest, please?
Thanks very much, Convener. Further to my earlier declaration, can I apologise to the committee for omitting to mention that my wife is a local government councillor?
Thank you very much, Gordon. And can I remind Gordon and all other members to declare any relevant interests as and when they might arise at future committee meetings. Thank you. Agenda item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Items 4 and 5 are consideration of the evidence heard today. Item 6 is consideration of our work programme. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object? Thank you very much. Then that is agreed. Items 4, 5 and 6 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2 is a community wellbeing. The committee is taking evidence in post-legislative scrutiny of the Community Empowerment Act 2015. Parts 3 and 5. Today we're taking evidence from 3 public bodies which participated in the committee's survey of the effectiveness of Parts 3 and 5. And we're keen to explore some of the issues you raised. Today I welcome John Mayer, Director of Estates Development, Forestry and Land Scotland, Leslie Forsyth, Senior Manager, North Ayrshire Council, and Elizabeth Manson, Community Planning Engagement Manager, Dumfries and Galloway. Thank you all for being here today, and please note we've just over an hour for this session. Some brief technical information. There's a pre-arranged questioning order and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. As there are 3 panellists, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance by raising your hand, and don't feel the need to answer every question if your views are generally in line with points already made. And could everyone please give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak? Thank you. And before I move on to the questions, I should have said earlier on that we received apologies from Annie Wells this morning, just hoping to join the meeting later on, but she's put in her apologies at this stage. Okay, and I will begin with the first question. 2 seconds. Maybe could the witnesses explain what community empowerment means to their organisation, how they measure empowerment in the communities that they work with? And I'm happy to take any of the witnesses. Elizabeth Manson, I have you on the screen. Would you be happy to start? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning all. Thank you for this opportunity to join in your discussions. Community empowerment is certainly a priority for Dumfries and Galloway Council, and we have been very supportive of this approach for a number of years. It is very much for us about making the most of communities and for people to achieve their potential within their own locality. So in terms of measuring community empowerment, I think we have a number of different approaches to community empowerment, and particularly through annual reports and assessments that we look at how we're delivering on these. So the Community Asset Transfer Annual Report, for example, tells us not only how many buildings and land we've transferred, but we do a survey of people to see how they have found it, what their satisfaction level is with the support of the Council and this approach. We've not had, as you will see, as many participation requests, but we certainly engage with community groups about how they are feeling about the range of tools that we have, so not just participation requests, but also we have ward events and we have community conversations, and we take assessment at all of these about people's satisfaction Did they feel that they had the opportunity to contribute? Did they feel that they were able to influence their council and councillors? I hope that gives you a flavour of Dumfries and Galloway Council's views. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much. Leslie Forsyth, would you like to come in at this stage?
Would be delighted to. Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks for the opportunity for everybody today. My colleagues in Dumfries and Galloway, North Ayrshire Council put our citizens at the very heart of what we do, and that's a level. We have a range of mechanisms, as most people will have, in relation to how we make empowerment not become a thing that has to be done by request, but a thing that is part and parcel of our day-to-day work. That includes our own finances through participatory budgeting, which is becoming more and more the norm for all of our services, not just through grants, but through engagement about how people would like to see core budgets spent across the council. We've just engaged in a whole range of budget engagement sessions with our Chief Exec and Leader. They've been online sessions with our communities. That goes through our community asset transfer is groaning at the seams and very, very busy, and that again is a credit to our communities, who clearly feel empowered to the point that they are able to take on those assets for them to be the best community assets they can possibly be. I believe that our participation request and our low number of participation requests is actually evidence in relation to how involved people do actually feel. Through our locality partnerships, we've got 6 locality partnerships. Again, it's an equal vote footing between our elected members and our community reps who are on those locality partnerships, and that balance is then further exacerbated into the bonus of our communities by having local chit chats, where again on a monthly basis local people are engaging in local matters that affect their own areas. All of that contributes to us not really just having an empowered community, but having citizens who have got really pride in their community and who are aware of the routes that are coming into the decision-making processes and factors that directly affect them, and indeed their aspirations for the future. Because as an authority, we believe that really is what we're here to do, is to work with our communities to get them empowered to that point for those aspirations. The final point I would probably say is that, like everybody, we probably struggle to understand how we evaluate that, because in some cases that is a feeling rather than a hard factual or stats that we can reply back to Scottish Government. We have, however, got many case studies of evidence, and they're a very effective way that we've had of using that. But recently we're incredibly proud of our best value report that we went through just prior to lockdown. In fact, the results came in just at lockdown, which again highlighted the good practice round about community empowerment and various processes from our localities that across North Ayrshire was shown as an area of strength for us.
Okay, thank you very much for that full response. It was interesting that when you were talking about, you think the low participation requests were because you think you already include the local community, that Liz Manson was nodding her head vigorously. But John Mayer, I wonder if you'd like to give us your views of how that's going?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Thank you, members. I think we engage with communities at various levels within Forest and Land Scotland. So from the when we bring out the land management plans, we involve communities as to what we plan to do with the forest and have that level of engagement and consultation during the land management plan process. That's a really important part of our engagement with local communities across the whole country. When it comes to looking at how we can engage the communities and allowing them to use the forest well, a lot of lease opportunities with them to allow them to access the forest and actually have activities in the forest. And when it comes to community asset transfer, clearly that's a very important part of what we do. We've got a dedicated team who are involved in that side of it. So we do voluntary notifications for asset disposals, which again really engages the community at the very first part when we're considering disposal of any assets. At the same time, in terms of the community asset transfer requests, we've got a team that can really engage with communities very early on to work through the proposals, to actually develop the proposals and really have a real hands-on approach to that whole community engagement process and community asset transfer process. So I think how we measure that, I think, is a really good question, because it's way more than just transferring an asset. It's what then happens with that asset and how that really improves the community's well-being and ability to generate, I think, a lot of the time economic benefits, but also social benefits. So that's not necessarily part of, I think as one of the other contributors said, it's hard sometimes to measure that. But certainly from the feedback of projects like Ferrypools Car Park and the Carron Valley, that what they've then gone on and actually delivered in a very short period of time, and the tangible benefits, I think, is very encouraging. And it would be really good to be able to capture more of that as it goes on, because some of these, you're not getting instant improvements. It's something that will take time to develop and grow. I think being able to continue to monitor that's really important, just to kind of demonstrate the long-term benefits to the communities.
Yeah, it's interesting that you all say that it's difficult to gauge what the impact is, but although the Community Empowerment Act's been in place for a number of years now and community ownership continues to grow, the National Performance Framework, which I suppose is one of the few ways that we have of identifying these types of feelings, it tells us that the sense of community empowerment is reducing across Scotland and significantly lower than it was in 2013. Would MD have any insights into what could help to explain this trend? Leslie, I'll start with you on this one, if you don't mind.
I think increasingly, certainly in North Ayrshire, we're seeing more and more people who do wish to take ownership of assets. They do wish to be involved in things, major things like community wealth building initiatives, the Ayrshire Growth Deal and some of those bigger ticket items. And equally, again, we've got more and more people who are happy to take part in our formal processes. I'm not convinced that that then brings about a sense of community cohesion or civic pride, and I think that's probably more where people potentially feel slightly disengaged, that it's not maybe about their empowerment levels, but it is maybe more about how they're feeling about society or how they're feeling about their own towns and that civic pride and that sense of belonging. And it's certainly something at a local level we're doing all we can in North Ayrshire to try and looking at our areas, especially areas of deprivation where people are living within really critical situations, that it's very difficult to then feel empowered in some of those situations when you're actually affected by poverty. And potentially, as that's on the during the pandemic in particular, people have maybe felt further away from that. But as I say, certainly across North Ayrshire, the engagement that we have with our communities and our community groups, we're seeing more and more people wishing to be more involved and taking ownership of issues in their local areas. And that's from flower beds to running town halls and right through to decision-making processes and being part of boards of values, etc. So I'm challenged and struggling, to be honest, convener, to give you a particularly formal answer to that, and I apologise for that. It would be interesting to see how we could be part of the solution, that if that is something that Scottish Government are keen to explore, we would certainly be keen to help and support with anything that might come through from that. Again, the connections we've got into the communities, we would be keen to work on that and explore that and see if at a local level that really is who people are feeling.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Liz Manson?
Yes, thank you. Again, I would certainly concur with that view that there will be wider influences on how people are feeling about their engagement and their influence. I think it's not necessarily just about the community empowerment in terms of assets and participation with public bodies, but indeed the wider poverty agenda and perhaps the media issues that people are reading about, that is going to perhaps make them feel that they don't have as great to have. Certainly we see expectation has risen in recent years about people's involvement. And there was a very interesting part, I think, one of the recommendations from the independent evaluation about making sure that community asset transfer isn't just for articulate community groups that perhaps are already got a range of skills, that we need to be making sure that we're supporting groups from all different levels of society and in different places. And I think that's a very helpful reminder to us that we need to be making sure that empowerment is something for everyone across our region. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. There's a couple of issues that have been raised with the last two that will be brought up, I'm sure, by my colleagues in greater depth. But John Mayor, if you have a quick response at this stage, then I'll move on to the Vice Convener after that.
Certainly, Convener, thanks. I think very quickly, I think it's quite different around the country that we see, because obviously we touch on very different areas. So I think some communities feel very empowered, others feel much less so. And I kind of wonder perhaps there's more of a positive role to play in terms of encouraging them to actually understand some of the powers and empowerment they do have, and that perhaps what I call maybe almost like a pastoral role to sort of try and encourage them more to be more involved and how they can achieve that. And I can wonder maybe part of that is communication and encouragement. I do think certainly in the deprived areas, as the other contributors have said, that I think there's a kind of general kind of feeling of just this lack of power generally, and certainly in terms of driving development or economic benefits and trying to get life back into those, particularly the kind of more remote rural communities.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass you on to the Deputy Convener, Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's been really good to read your written submissions, and very interested in the initial presentations you've all given us today. So thank you for making that contribution. And can I ask you a bit about why so few participation requests are being submitted, North Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway? Before the evidence sessions, you maybe have thought that it's because you're not enthusiastic about receiving them. And that's because of the evidence we had from community groups last time and in terms of our written evidence. But is there a cultural difference here? It feels to me like you've got a community participation officer and you've got a culture in both councils to try and encourage participation. So are there lessons learned about what you were doing before the Act, what you've done to change? And maybe if I could go to North Ayrshire first, it's striking that you've only had 3 participation requests. Do you see that more because of the culture of the organisation being open? Or can you just tell us about the 3 requests you've had and how you processed them and what the outcomes were? So if I could go first of all to Leslie from North Ayrshire. Thanks.
Certainly, I think to answer the first point, I think that good practice when planning any new strategy or project or development now does include things like a stakeholder reference group from the very start. So, we're about to do a huge investment in the area in Ardrossan. It includes a massive community campus and new school campus. And before even a plan is in place, there is huge engagement with our communities and stakeholder reference groups set up. So the networks are already there and people have been invited and people are asking to be involved, and there are ways they can be involved. So I would always hope that eliminates the need for people to feel the need to put in a participation request, because they are already there at the heart of it, as I say, before even a brick is laid within that facility. So that is for me, that is about good practice. I can't really comment whether that's as a result of the Community Empowerment Act, but I can't say that it didn't help to push everybody on, that it is good practice for people to be involved in any decision making that is going on round about them that affects their futures. And for that campus in particular, that's from our early years right through to our senior citizens across Ardrossan that's got that involvement. Of the 3 requests that are in, interestingly, 2 came from the exact same very small neighbourhood in Ardeer, and both were in relation to the Ayrshire Growth Deal. And indeed, there are members from both of those groups on both of the committees that made the request. And it was very simply to be involved in the Ayrshire Growth Deal. They saw the publicity, they saw the high-powered media presence that was coming from that. And immediately when it was at that higher level, the local community said, well, we want a piece of that and we want to be involved in that, and quite rightly so. And in both occasions, that is what has happened. I would probably defend and say it was more to do with timing, that they potentially felt that the discussions about Ayrshire Growth Deal were maybe further down the line than they actually were. So as soon as it was muted in a local press and indeed the national press, both those local groups wished that involvement and are now involved with that. The third one was to do again with a large development in the Garnock Valley at Loch Shore, and again the particular group who were there, they potentially saw it as a bit of a threat to some of the work they were currently doing, and they just wanted more information, to be really honest with you. And a working group was set up, and they are part and centre of that. So of the 3 that are there, it was a very easy solution to have things put in place. None of them were in any way, I have to say, controversial, and it was very amicable in terms of how that was resolved. But I would get back to that point that it's about how we have a culture of engagement from the start that then means people are not feeling the need to use what is a legal mechanism to be able to have that engagement.
Yeah, thank you for that. Elizabeth from Dumfries and Galloway, you only had one participation request. So have you got an officer that enables people to come forward for their participation request? Can you give us a little bit of background as to your participation request and what happened to it?
Yes, certainly. Very similar picture to Leslie in North Ayrshire. And interestingly, when we introduced the participation request procedure and strategy, and it was exactly the same timing, it's exactly the same approach that we have for community asset transfer, single point of contact, a very clear flowchart procedure so that people can understand how it works. And we had a conversation at the time that it was almost a failure on the council's engagement approach if people had to resort to the entitlement, that because we hadn't enabled their engagement and their involvement in other ways, that perhaps we didn't necessarily need people to go through this formal route to be able to be involved in our activity. I think we again, similar to other councils, the other mechanisms that we have, which have got the same approach. We have ward events where people can ask to meet with their local ward members about any subject at all that isn't already under a programme of engagement. We have community conversations which take place on various aspects that are perhaps very local issues, like street scene services, like public conveniences and their customer service centres, participatory budgeting. We have a stakeholder approach to impact assessment. So I hope you're seeing from that we have a number of routes that people can get involved in. The one participation request that we had, as you said, was about greater involvement across the council in terms of all aspects of its engagement. So we have facilitated this particular group to be part of our community planning participation and engagement group, which brings together the engagement officers from a range of organisations working across the region. And they have a shared best practice. They also have a joint programme of engagement activities so that we're making sure that we are complementary. And we've also trained over 200 officers across partners, elected members, board members, and importantly in our equality groups, in engagement techniques, so that this group, the part of the outcome of their participation request is that they are now members of that group and they're able to influence and work with engagement officers across the region. And I think that particular programme of work, that training, we were delighted that we were awarded the Consultation Institute's UK Council of the Year last year for that investment in training.
So you are both very positive about the impact of the work you're doing in terms of community engagement. Can you summarise quite briefly, because I think I've only got 2 minutes left, what you think the benefits are councils put in that investment as well as the communities, because we're not getting that same energy and culture shift in terms of the experience from many community groups across the country. If you're selling this to other councils, what are the big benefits for them as well as their communities? Maybe pick you, Leslie, first and then come back to you, Elizabeth.
Certainly, the key thing for me, and I don't mean to be flippant about it, it's the difference between our residents being customers of the council and being citizens of North Ayrshire. It's that cultural shift for us, which is about not being a customer and phoning up and demanding what they want the council to do, but having true engagement. Very, very simply put, it's the difference between somebody phoning up to complain the drain outside their house gets blocked by leaves every autumn and phoning up to say, I'm really keen to be involved in my local pick-up litter group because the block, if I can help keep the drains unblocked, and it saves that. So for me, it's the difference of a cultural shift between customers and citizens and going on that journey. It's the parent-child relationship, and the gains and the benefits that we as a council get are phenomenal. I'm not saying it's not a harder shift sometimes working with our communities, of course it is, but it's a different kind weekends of hard work, and it's such a rewarding piece of work to do. And that's the huge thing for me, going from a customer to a citizen.
Yeah, that's really well put. Elizabeth, have you got a similar kind of enthusiasm? Because we want this to be captured by everybody. What are the benefits?
Absolutely, and we can evidence through, you know, we're just started working a peer learning video that we are seeing there's health and well-being benefits, there's economic benefits, people are much more engaged through their volunteering, and indeed for the council and the community there are financial benefits as well. One of the things we've introduced is using a social value tool, and already this year we've seen that there's a £3.47 return for every £1 discount we're giving on a community asset, and that's a tangible demonstration of the value that this can bring. And also, you know, there are some assets which are legacy buildings and land, and if the council doesn't have to maintain these, then clearly there's a financial benefit as well to the public body.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Alexander?
Good morning, convener, and good morning, panel. If I can maybe ask some questions about the asset transfer. While we've spoken to community groups and taken some evidence, there has been, without question, a frustration that came through from them about sometimes the mutually beneficial outcomes that are trying to be achieved when that asset is transferred. So it would be quite good to get a view from each of you about how you deal with that process within your own organisation and how communities and public bodies work together to ensure that you get that mutually beneficial outcome in achieving that asset transfer. And I don't mind which one of you want to start. Whoever.
John, do you want to come in this one at first?
Yes, convener, I'm happy to do that. I think the benefits for the community, I think the discussion we would largely have with them is obviously as part of the transfer, is exploring the benefits and the ambitions of the community as to what they want to do with it. And often that is then translated into some form of discount on the price, so that in terms of the benefits they're bringing through the transfer, that can be reflected in what we can then offer as part of the package. So I think in terms of being able to engage with the community in that way, that's probably the most kind of obvious way that we engage in that way. But certainly the dialogue and the discussions that we have with the communities all the way through is all about really helping them and understand, you know, how the best can get the best out of the assets and how they can demonstrate that case. And also the support, and I think a key part of it is the sustainability of their ambitions. And I think that's a really strong part of the dialogue that we have with them, that, you know, they can always start off well, but then make sure that they also continue that all the way through and deliver those benefits and make sure that, you know, they're not necessarily over ambitious, but make sure they've got a kind of clear way of delivering. And you know, in a way, in a sustainable way, and that's a very important part. So that really does form a lot of the dialogue that we have with the communities.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, Liz.
Thank you, yes. So part of the process that we have is there's a stage one expression of interest, and that's where our ward officer, we have one for every ward in the council, works with the community group just to make sure that this is the right thing for their group and their community, that developing their business plan is done, and also the community engagement that they undertake as part of their developing their community asset transfer request. We have really a very strong third sector interface, and they work well with the groups about their business plan and about their constitutional arrangements and funding. And we've recently had very positive conversations with the new South of Scotland enterprise about their involvement working with groups to support the development of their business plan. I think very similar story about the long-term implications and sustainability is something that we're working on just now. We've just recently had a scrutiny review on the long-term implications the importance of using that social value tool, of repeating it perhaps in future years to make sure that the business plan is and the way in which the asset is being used is delivering on what was the mutual benefit identified at the start.
Yep. Leslie?
Yeah, apologies. I get super excited about community asset transfers actually simply because I think the mutual benefits are heightened, not as a result of the final piece of paper, but as a result of the process that our groups go through. As Elizabeth said, it is a process. You know, people don't just put in their paperwork one day and it's approved, you know, a couple of weeks later. We work with them to build that capacity. They are better and stronger by the end of that process because they have worked through and they have been questioned about their constitution, their business plan, their financial stability, etc., etc. I mean, again, I have beautiful case studies that I can share with you that extols the benefits that they feel they have gained from that process. At a very hard end, I would also say that a number of our community asset transfers have also been historical leases that community groups have had in place with the authority prior to community asset being a thing. So they may have a 20-year lease of a bowling green, for example. Well, being really blunt, instead of paying us £500 a year lease, if they go through a community asset transfer and pay a small amount, it's theirs forever. So there is a financial longer term gain from what they are doing. I will be honest, we've never, although we have a list of assets that are able to be asset transferred and that we would be happy to engage with, we've never as a council been proactive in pushing buildings out for community asset transfer, which I feel others may have. That process, we've always felt, puts pressure on a community to think they've got to do something or they've got to do the right thing for their building or what else is going to happen to it. And we've never ever taken that approach. We will always work with our community groups, even sometimes, and in many cases, it's not buildings that sit on our asset register. They're coming asking, what would the chance be? And we explore that and we have those conversations. So the mutual benefits for us are measurable in some ways in terms of that social return, measurable in some ways financial return, as I say, but it's the journey and it's the capacity building of our groups to be more empowered to do more things in their community that is the huge thing that clearly comes through, certainly from the groups that I've had the privilege to work with.
Thank you.
And Leslie and John, you both talk about the enthusiasm there and the sustainability. And Leslie, you mentioned there about the group feeling that if they don't take it on board, then it will be lost to the community, whatever location or building that it is, because it maybe was once in the council's ownership or someone else's ownership. And as I say, if they're not the future, then it will vanish. And I think that has been very much evidenced as we progress. So ensuring that the outcomes are measured and ensuring that you get what you want from that process from both parties, I think, is very beneficial. So going back to the sustainability that you talked about earlier, John, when you were trying to explain what your role and responsibility is, how do you measure that sustainability and how do you support that going forward for the organisations that have gone through that journey and gone through that process?
I think similar to the other contributors, I think the business plan and making sure that is a strong business plan that's put together as part of the process, and to be quite clear about the strength of community engagement, the strength of community support, and to ensure that is all part of that process. I think it's a really important part. So, to me, the building blocks at the start really will dictate the success, further downstream. So making sure these real, the building blocks are well put together and well articulated, well thought out, and certainly the resource requirements that are required to maintain that are clearly set out at the start. So I think that the kind of spade work almost done at the start is the really important part, because then that will then drive everything else that flows from there. And I think so we are very careful, and it does take time, because a lot of the questions we're asking and a lot of the things, it is a learning curve for the communities, and it's something that step by step. So I can imagine that sometimes it will feel this time scale is quite frustrating because it takes quite a bit of time, but at the same time it's really important to make sure that the right questions are asked to ensure that they're not taking on something that actually ultimately will not deliver or will just kind of slide off, and to make sure that it does deliver the benefits and deliver the opportunities that they really have set out to achieve. So I think that early part of the early work that's done is really critical.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Keith Brown, please.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks to the panel for their contributions, and my apologies in advance if my connection drops out, as it's done a few times already. Just to say that I think the point that Convener made previous is that we're getting quite a different view from certainly the councils in this session than we have from a lot of the witnesses that have spoken before. Both seem to think there are explanations for the small number of participation requests or indeed asset transfers, except some councils think that's a mark of the success, and whereas a lot of people feel that they cannot really properly access the councils or it's not worth the candle given their experience. I just wonder, given that, especially for the councils, if it's the case a very low number of participation requests is a mark of the success of the different engagement strategies of the two councils, have those engagement strategies come about as a result of the Community Empowerment Act, or has the Act been essentially a dead letter in that respect? Were they always there, or are they a response to the Community Empowerment Act? That's maybe Leslie first.
Yeah, again, thank you. I think maybe I touched on it, so thanks for the opportunity to kind of further explore it. It's very hard to judge who doesn't come forward. As you know, it's easier for us to engage with those who do. It's very hard to judge why people don't. The key driver for me really is a belief that North Ayrshire Council has in its culture and its very root about engagement and about having that co-design, co-creation of services, and that in itself does preclude people from feeling the need to then use an act to be engaged and to come forward. And it's chicken and egg for me. I think that was the case, but what the Empowerment Act did was certainly give us a policy and a framework in which to host our culture on. So yes, we believed it was good practice. Yes, we worked with Consultation Institute looking at good practice. We've rolled that out to our community planning partners across police and across fire and rescue, etc. So all of the community partners are very, very focused on having our communities at the heart of our decision-making way of working. But the Empowerment Act has then just boosted that. It has given it a place to reside. It's given it a meaning and it's given it a context by which we can say this isn't just about good practice or what we as officers think is good practice. This is something that has proven, that has merit, and that is the expectation of our own government and our own governing structures, that this is what we should be doing. So I see both as being a tandem, and maybe that's why in North Ayrshire we feel it's particularly successful, that our practice and our culture is in complete alignment with what is policy and what is law, and we can use them to be mutually beneficial, rather than for people to use it as a result of being disengaged or wanting to become engaged. That we can work both in parallel. The culture goes along with the policy and goes along with the law.
And just on that, for community participation requests and for asset transfers, do you have a single point of contact? On what level is that official in the council, if you do?
The single point of contact will always be, so there is one route obviously into that, which is through as same process. You have that initial engagement paperwork to come in, and then a single point of contact is allocated to each individual group. So the single point in contact can vary. So although I'm lead for all community asset transfers, the individual groups do not all come to me. They come to the person within our community empowerment team that is best placed to support them. That might be down to geography, or it might be down to a very thematic. So if we have a sports organisation look at an asset transfer of a football field, it may be somebody in our more aligned with their sports. So a single point of contact is tailored to the actual request that comes in, whether that's participation or whether it is a community asset transfer.
Okay, and Elizabeth, on whether the Community Empowerment Act has had any impact?
Yes, certainly. Again, a similar journey, I think, as some other councils, where we already had work on our participation and engagement strategy. We have a youth participation strategy, a parental engagement strategy. So across all services in the council, we were certainly already on that journey. But the strength of legislation has given it a profile and essentially a backbone to the work that we were doing. So it has given it a real boost. And clearly there's also been work at national level because of its legislative nature about evaluation work and bringing people together to discuss their shared experiences. So I think it's been a helpful complementary element of this programme of work. And also to pick up your question about, we have a senior manager.
Can you go?
No, we have a senior manager who's responsible for both the community asset transfer and the participation requests. And then we have a ward worker who picks up the individual contact. They're based in each of the localities. So generally speaking, they will know the community groups and they will know the people involved, which gives them a degree of confidence and helps them with a number of things, perhaps not just their PR or their CAT. Thank you.
And John, are you able to say about whether you have a single point of contact? It's just that previous witnesses said that was the most important thing. They felt if you could go to different people for different things, it just got lost in the system, whereas one person with clout was an important thing. How do you deal with it, John?
Well, Rebecca, who was probably due to be here today but couldn't make it, she is our kind of main conduit through which we will engage with community interests. I've also got another dedicated resource, Craig, who gets involved in this. So they have got oversight over everything pretty much that we are doing in terms of community engagement. And I think that's really important because it means that we deal with communities consistently. It means that, you know, they're getting the same messages, but also in terms of having that, being able to learn from what's worked and what hasn't, or what actually could be done better. I think part of that learning process is really important. So I think certainly that the team that we've got in place is really important, and I think that does respond to that recommendation that you know, you've got this conduit through which you get that the communities can flow into and get that consistent point of contact and consistent advice and approach and engagement. So yes, we have that, and I think it's a really important part of how we operate.
Okay, thanks for that. My last question, if I've got time, Convener, is just to ask each of the panellists if Leslie mentioned about the less tangible effects of a successful asset transfer in the community feeling empowered. Are each of the panellists able to give us an example of where that, we had one in a previous session as well, where it really seemed to empower the community, felt it could make a change and a difference? Are the panel able to give us an example of that? And similarly, are they able to give us an example where an asset transfer has occurred that hasn't worked and the council's had to step back in again? Leslie first.
Yeah, happy to. To answer the second question first, if that's okay, we've never had an asset returned where we've had to step back in. We do have some measures in place. For example, we've got a pretty high profile town hall asset transfer at the moment that was literally agreed an asset, the decision letter sent out just about a week or two before lockdown. And if you can imagine, the funding dominoes that they had lined up are now very precarious. So we actually have a process in place with them that we will, should that not come to fruition in the way that all the business plans and all the structures and all the planning had been in place ready for it, our legal department have worked with our lawyer to make sure that we have a safety net, I think is the best way to phrase that. However, that's not been the case so far. They are still proactive in what they're doing, but we were very conscious that the landscape in which that asset transfer was agreed changed dramatically in March, and we've taken cognizance of that. So the asset has not come back, but we do have a mechanism to make it happen just in case, in order to give that group the security, I think it is, that is the best word, to allow that to be the case. I could fill up the rest of the time telling you wonderful stories about what our asset transfers have meant to many groups, but if it's all right, I'll share one with you. We had a hall was asset transferred to a local brass band. a very, very long-serving pillar of the community, and they were keen to have their own premises. And the joy that I saw in their younger members' faces, now they hadn't been involved in the form filling or doing any of the work, the joy that I could see in their faces, they could immediately see they had a sense of belonging, they had a sense of place, they had somewhere that their instruments were stored and were safe and were organised, and it wasn't in boxes under people's beds and in garages. And those young people were able to articulate to me better than any of us, I think, probably has ever been seen before, what it meant to them to have somewhere to call their own and somewhere that they could see not just rehearsals taking place, but as I say, they were talking about some people who didn't like larger crowds and they really struggled, and they were able to come there in a one-to-one tuition. They spoke about being able to have concerts there. They spoke about just the joy. Just the joy for them is more than enough to be able to see what it means to them to have some of those assets.
Very much. Okay, is that you, Keith? Oh,
unless Elizabeth wants to come in, she's desperate to come in, convener. So.
Yes, I am indeed, yes. Thank you. Yes, again, fantastic. I'll pick out one for you, which is the Dumfries Men's Shed. And by taking on an asset, it has enabled them to expand the range of services and the work that they do. That it has, there'll be social isolation reduction. They're going to do some diversion work with some school pupils, particularly perhaps those that are having some challenges at school. And so that whole intergenerational work is something that they're very excited about, and they're getting support as well from our local health service. So it's just bringing the different things together, that is a really positive example of that empowerment and the increase in confidence that the members are experiencing. And again, we have not had any that have come back into council ownership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy?
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. Welcome to the panel. The provisions of the Community Empowerment Act in Section 8 on asset transfer require public authorities to go through a fairly complex decision-making process under Part Section 82, balancing all the kind of advantages, disadvantages and all the rest of it. Can you say something about how you found that decision-making process, how easy you found it to apply that decision-making process and come to a decision on an asset transfer request that is clear and not substantially disputed? Maybe I could just start with Leslie.
Thank you for the question. I would reflect that the process that is required and the engagement that is required and the journey that our groups come on makes it actually a very clear understanding of what those benefits are. As Liz just mentioned, when you deal with one particular group who are then very eloquent in telling me what are the health benefits, what are the education benefits, what are our social return on our investment, what does it mean to our young people, what does it mean to our senior citizens, all of that information comes through in that process. And I have never, in all of the asset transfers I've worked on, there's been several, I've never had an occasion where anything has been anything other than positive. I think people require a lot of work to go into making an asset transfer happen, and they don't do it flippantly, and they have all came at it for the right reasons, with the community at the heart and with the asset being used to the maximum potential for that community, whether that's a football field or a building. They've always came through, and it's actually quite cathartic to see how best they can do that. Men's Shed movement, as Liz just said, is one of the best in terms of, at the moment, to actually highlight the strands of additionality that can come through the community asset transfer process and what it means to our groups and what level it can take them to operate. So yeah, I've never had an issue, as we've worked through with them very closely, to prove what that means to groups, to make the decision anything other than quite simplistic, that it's a great idea at the end of this. And as I say, if any ever came in that wasn't, we've got a really robust process to work that through that would clearly highlight where the fragilities may be, and we would probably explore an alternative route for them.
Okay, thank you. Liz, do you have any observations on the decision-making process?
Absolutely, yes. We have a two-stage decision-making process. It goes first to our area committee, where clearly the members there will know the asset, know the group, and they bring to that discussion that local insight. And then the area committee makes a recommendation to the strategic committee, which ultimately makes the decision. We have had a review of our procedure at the end of last year, and we've also just completed a scrutiny review on long-term implications and what we've called complex CATs. And I think that's the area that I would just like to explore with you just now, that it's where we have a straightforward CAT request, which is one community group for one asset. Again, reflecting what Leslie has said, that's been very straightforward. And the information and evidence presented to the members, which is a business case, which includes the community engagement that they've done. And we have also we've introduced since this year the social value tool. We also give obviously the market price for the asset so that members are aware of the financial implications of that. And the work that we're doing just now is likely to bring the social value tool for all community assets, as well as a scoring panel. Now, we have used a scoring panel where we've had complex CATs in the past. And that, for example, we've had a CAT where we've had two community transfer bodies applying for the same property. We've had a CAT where we've had a below market value offer and a market value offer. And we've also had a CAT where we've had a below market value and a CAT offer. So these are seen, we call these the complex CATs, and in each case there we've had an inter-service scoring panel so that we're giving the elected members that additional information on which to base their decision. Our scrutiny review has identified that perhaps we need more information about the property condition, so that again members are taking that into account. But the discussion that we've been having is that yes, we can give members, and that's the officer's role, is to provide members with the information, the evidence that we have. But at the end of the day, I think one of the phrases that was used by one of the members was it is about an investment of faith in a community group and a community to be able to take this asset and develop it in the long term, because at the moment we simply don't know the long term implications. And so it is very much a judgment and an investment by the public body in the community group and the community with that asset. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. And John, if you don't mind, in the interest of time, I'll just move on. Leslie mentioned a case you're working on in North Ayrshire regarding a town hall, which leads me to ask, that town hall will almost certainly be part of the Common Good Fund. How are you dealing with common good properties in relationship to asset transfer? Have you had any, and what have been the issues? I could start with you, Leslie, please.
It is indeed. It was part of the common good, and we've worked with our legal colleagues to have it alienated from the common good. So that process has been achieved. As I say, it just makes, as Elizabeth said, some CATs are slightly more complicated than others, and when it is common good, either land or asset, then we deal with that. But there are processes and mechanisms in place. Our legal team have been, as I say, tested with that process and been through that process, and it has been successfully alienated, which was, the community asset transfer couldn't have been approved without that having taken place.
Okay, thank you. Have you encountered any problems in Dumfries and Galloway in relation to that, Liz?
Well, very similar. Where it's a common good property, we go to the common good subcommittee of the area committee for them to make a determination as well. So that's covered in their disposal and acquisition policy also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Convener, if you have a minute for a question to John. Yeah, sure. So one of the issues with asset transfer, obviously, is you're taking an asset that's owned on behalf of, in the case of councils, the citizens who live in the council area. In the case of an asset owned by Scottish ministers, which you manage, land that's owned by all of the people of Scotland, and you're transferring it to a very small subset of the people of Scotland. How do you balance that? How do you balance those interests when you're making decisions about asset transfer, John?
It's a good point, and I think part of that dialogue that we have with the community is to make sure that they understand the nature of what they're taking on to manage, and to make sure that it's managed well. So particularly in terms of land has to be managed. So I think part of that dialogue that we have with communities is to make sure that this is managed as well as it would have been done had it still been held within Forestry and Land Scotland. And I think that's a really important part, that they can then deliver the add-on and the benefits, rather than just kind of do what we could do. So if all they're proposing to do is what we would do, we would argue we're best placed to do it. But if there's real add-on benefits and real kind of deliverables that can happen, then it's both and. So as long as that is demonstrable, I think that's a really important part of the decision-making process. And whilst we have, largely agreed most of the transfer requests that have come through for us, there's been a lot of the conversation during that time, and to make sure that, like I say, that when the asset is transferred, that everything is realistic and deliverable. But how that interacts with what we might have round about it is really important as part of that understanding, and then that's part of the process we go through in the decision-making process to make sure we identify all the issues or all the potential issues and manage that as part of the as I say, the decision-making, but also the transfer process.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you, Andy. And finally, Gordon MacDonald, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just wanted to ask a couple of quick questions regarding asset transfers. I recently had a community group in my area, Collington Village Enterprise, take over a coach house, which has now become a community heritage hub, and they received £48,000 from the Scottish Land Fund. And I'm just wondering, given that each of you have had experience in quite a lot of asset transfers, either in the process of being evaluated or being concluded, how important is the Scottish Land Fund to community transfers?
Would you like me to come in, Convener? Is that okay?
Yes.
I would say in many of ours, the Scottish Land Fund is one of their options that many of them are looking at, especially where it's an asset that they are looking for either adaptations to be done or renovations to be done. The majority of our groups who are taking on an asset that's in pretty good condition, and their future aspirations are for how they can mould and change it to fit. So certainly there is a host of potential funders that are in there, but Land Fund Trust is one of them, definitely. We do have an issue that I think it would be prudent for me to bring that. When our groups are going through the process of community asset transfer, they do have a hiatus point where they don't actually own the asset, but some large funders wish them to have ownership before they can make an application. So there is sometimes a little bit of backwards and forwards in terms of chicken and egg, that we can't make an application to some of our larger funders until we own it. And again, if there's any leeway in there in relation to potential not necessarily, well, a bit of relaxation of that, it would be a help. But certainly all of our funders right now, especially when it is about our assets and anything that can do for adaptations and for building works, is left and centre to make this be a viable, because the group themselves have got the capacity to do it. We know socially and economically it makes sense, but sometimes that big investment, like 48,000 kind of and above sort of investments, are becoming few and far between, especially when it's for our assets, and they are major contributions to our social areas and to our vibrancy of our communities. So any of our larger funders like that, absolutely, they're left and centre to the importance of community asset transfers.
Elizabeth or John?
Yes, thank you. Again, Scottish Land Fund Lottery, there are a number of funders that are really important to community groups. And I think one of the things just to highlight, when we're speaking to community groups at the first stage, expressions of interest, We often talk to them about whether a lease would be a better route, to let them sort of try it out before they take on full ownership. And clearly for some funders, there is a requirement for the group to own the asset before they were able to get funding from that particular source. That's another element that plays into which particular option is suitable for the community group and the community. Again, our third sector interface are very helpful in making sure that the community groups are able to access the most appropriate funding and maximise the funding that they possibly can in developing their business plan.
Before I ask John about his experience, Elizabeth, you just touched upon the fact long-term leases or leases of a community asset before they move on to purchase. But what are the factors that groups take into account to decide whether they're going to purchase the asset or lease it on a long-term basis? And if they're leasing it, is that the equivalent of a peppercorn rent, or is it a commercial rent? And what are the benefits?
I think the lease arrangement, we would often discuss that with them, perhaps where the volunteers have not previously been responsible for an asset, and perhaps we're still building the capacity and the skills, and perhaps also getting the community to test out whether the community has got that sustainability of looking after an asset. So it's been a really good way of letting them sort of test the water before they take on full ownership. And in terms of we have short-term management agreements as well as long-term leases. So we would just talk them through really about what one they want to try out, and then if it works out well in the short-term agreement, then they take on more and more. It doesn't necessarily need to be a commercial short-term agreement, then they take on more and more. It doesn't necessarily need to be a commercial lease, but again, that's part of the discussion. We've been developing what we've called a standardised lease, which has got some of the basic things in that, and then we'll have a conversation with them. They might have somebody in their community who's fire service trained, and they can take on some of the fire health and safety responsibilities. They might happen to have somebody else who's particularly good, an electrician perhaps, and they might take on the outside lighting. But we talk them through about what the council retains and what they're able to take on, and what we see is over time they're able to take on more, and indeed they have an appetite to take on more.
I mean, I can see the benefits of gradually learning how to look after property, etc. But with that, on the question of rent levels, is that peppercorn rents? Because I know in the past councils have rented property out to community groups at a peppercorn rent level. Is that what you would enter into for a long-term lease?
If the group wants to have, they would put almost an offer, when they give us their business plan, they will put in that what they're proposing to pay, and that's what the conversation with the committee is about, whether or not the council chooses to do that. So yes, it could be a peppercorn rent, it could be a commercial rent, or something in between, but we certainly have that dialogue with them.
Okay, thanks.
Leslie wants to come in and go.
Sorry?
Leslie wants to come in on that.
Sorry.
Quickly, that some of our groups, the Men's Shed movement being one, their national governing organisation, don't encourage their members at a local level to take full asset transfer ownership, and that they would encourage them to have a long-term lease. So on that basis, obviously the law actually allows us to do a CAT lease rather than a CAT ownership, and so that several of our groups have gone through that, and we will write into it, however, with an option to purchase at a later stage. So it allows them, just as you've said, the opportunity to try, test the water, see how they go, but we don't have to go through it again. And equally, in the same way that a value is put onto a land or a property for an asset transfer, we would look at what the commercial lease would be, and then take a small percentage of that based on a formula to do with social value in return. So they would be paying what in essence historically would be called a peppercorn rent, but it is based on what the commercial rent would be, taking in the factors that we've learned about the benefits of the community of them having that asset. So a fraction of the cost of a commercial rent, but still giving them, as I say, either a short or a long-term lease. So we've got lots of options that I think over time we have built up a portfolio, I think we call it in North Ayrshire, of different options that tries to help the groups get through the stages of where they would like to be, and most importantly where they're comfortable at being.
Okay, thanks very much. And John, have you got anything to add about funding of asset transfers?
I think certainly in terms of scale, I think the Scottish Land Fund is a critical part of the equation. I think looking at communities who are looking at quite large amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of pounds at times, I think the Scottish Land Fund has a critical part to play, and have played a critical part actually in making those things happen. I think clearly, across the whole community spectrum, I think we've got something like 90 odd leases. We've got almost 120 agreements. So it's not the only way, but certainly in terms of any assets of scale and any ownership requests, that once we get into the hundreds of thousands, Scottish Land Fund is very important and has been. And also, I'd say the renewables community benefit payments that quite a few communities have benefit from, that has had a big impact as well in terms of being able to deliver either transfer themselves or the projects within transfers. But certainly, yes, I think I would say for the type of transfers we do at the scale we often do, the Scottish Land Fund has been a critical element.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Gordon. Andy, I believe you've got a supplementary based on your previous questions.
Yes, thanks, Conveners. Just to follow up my questions to Leslie Forsyth from North Ayrshire in relationship to the disposal or alienation of the Town Hall. I just wonder, not now, but if you could perhaps write to the committee just explaining the legal basis on which that alienation took place, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Very much. I've got just one follow-up, and it was on Leslie's fabulous citizens not customers quote, but there's also talk about market value for properties. Is it always offered at market value, or did they sometimes give it cheaper, or how often do they give it cheaper? Because market value is obviously going to be a big issue for some community organisations that may well benefit the community and therefore the council. Leslie?
Yeah, happy to answer that. In all of the asset transfers I've dealt with, we have never requested a market value price at all. It's always, I mean, in one occasion, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, sometimes the asset and the property condition report actually ascertains that it's actually better to go for a very, very nominal sum of money because of what it could potentially carry on causing the council. So looking at it from a best value point of view, the town hall that we mentioned earlier, it was £1 that it went for. However, in most of our cases, it works round about 10% of market value. Once we put in that social value equation into it, in general, it's around about 10% of the market value.
That's great. Thanks very much for that. Liz, do you have any response to that?
Again, very rarely would it go for market value. That we have often, it's £1 that has been offered by the community group. We always make sure that the members are aware of the market value in the covering report. And indeed, in one instance where we have transferred industrial units, that there was a revenue income to the council. So the elected members need to know that position before they make a determination if they are transferring it for the nominal figure that has been offered by the community group.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much for that. That's very helpful. Okay, in that case, that takes us to the end of this evidence session. And can I just thank the witnesses very much? That was a very useful session. I think you can just finish now. We will plan to hold concluding evidence sessions with COSLA and Scottish Government and report to Parliament in the new year. And you can now just leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon. And I remind the committee members that we remain in public for the next item, and I'll suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover. Thank you very much again. Thank you. At agenda item 3, the committee is taking evidence on the European Charter of Local Self-Government and Corporation Scotland Bill. This is our concluding evidence on the bill at stage 1, and I welcome Andy Whiteman, member in charge of the bill, Neil Ross, Solicitor, Office of the Solicitor to the Scottish Parliament, and Andrew Milne, Head of Non-Government Bills Unit, and Vanda Knowles, Senior Assistant Clerk, SPCB. Thank you all for being here today. For information, we've allocated about an hour for this session, and we have a number of issues to discuss with you. Some brief technical information. There is a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. Andy, please state clearly if an official has been brought in to answer any questions. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end, and could everyone please give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. Andy, I believe you wish to make a brief opening statement.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Committee, and thanks to your committee for the work you've done in scrutinising this bill. I just want to briefly set out why I've introduced the bill and what it seeks to achieve. As the committee is aware, the European Charter of Local Self-Government is an international treaty whose substantive articles are set out in the schedule to the bill, and which guarantee a set of basic freedoms and protections for local government across the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. As things stand, this treaty does not have the force of law in Scotland unless and until it is incorporated into Scots law. Article 2 of the treaty states that the principle of local self-government shall be recognised in domestic legislation and, where practicable, in the Constitution. Now, the Council of Europe has noted that such recognition does not exist in Scotland, and thus we are already, arguably, in violation of the Charter by not giving it the full force of law. As things stand today, we are bound to comply with the Charter as an international legal instrument, but there's no means by which to ensure compliance because it's not part of domestic law and thus not justiciable. It's important to stress, as other witnesses have done, that this is not a sanctions-driven bill. It's designed to change the culture of compliance, principally through sections 3 and 8 that mandate continuous reflection on the extent of compliance by Scottish ministers, and consideration in section 8 by any MSP introducing a public bill of the extent to which that bill complies with the Charter. Incorporation of the treaty has long been argued for by COSLA, who indeed were involved in drafting the Charter back in the 1980s, and whose 2014 Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy recommended incorporation. The Consultative Steering Group in the Scottish Parliament argued for incorporation in 1999 and lamented the fact that it hadn't happened in their 20th anniversary report in 2019. Convener, the UK is at the bottom of the league table of European countries in having done nothing to give legal effect to the Charter. This bill remedies that, and I welcome questions from committee members.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. I'll just kick off by asking you to what extent and how you see the bill supporting the process of further devolution of local government.
By the further devolution of local government, you mean devolution of further powers?
Yes, and powers, yes. Further powers to the local government, yeah.
Well, in and of itself, the Charter doesn't require that. It sets out a set of basic freedoms and principles that should govern local government. It incorporates that into law, and thus any violation of that can be challengeable. But it's up to the national legislature the extent to which local government has what powers, and that's the case throughout Council of Europe member states. So it doesn't place any duties or expectations of any specific functions that should be devolved to local government. I suppose one could argue that in improving the culture of compliance, it is a bill that's designed to strengthen local government, and to that extent would add weight to arguments from those, including myself, in fact, who believe that local government should have more powers. But in and of itself, the Charter doesn't do that.
Okay, so basically, would you say that it sends out a message more than giving, as you say, further powers to local governments, further devolution of powers to local government itself? Then many witnesses and submissions have suggested that's the main benefit to sending out this message of parity between the Scottish Government and local government?
Well, I think
so
it's
sending a message or more practical, tangible outcomes from it.
Well, I've heard witnesses say that it sends a message. I've also heard the Scottish Government say that it's a significant constitutional change. I would argue it's somewhere in the middle. It is not a bill that merely sends a message. It does send a message. It sends a very, very important political message. It incorporates a very, very important principle, but it also has substantive legal effect, because at the moment, if any local authority or indeed any citizen believes that the Charter is not being complied with in any way, they can reference that in any court proceedings, but the court cannot rule on that question because the Charter is not part of Scots law. They can really say, well, that's all very interesting, but there's nothing we can do about it. So by giving legal teeth to the Charter, that is the main means by which the bill seeks to strengthen local government. And in doing so, it sends a very strong signal. Yes, I would agree, Convener, of the parity of esteem that should exist between different spheres of elected representation, which I think one witness stressed the other week is very important. So just as the Scottish Parliament has a founding statute, the Scotland Act, and various protocols in place to ensure that its powers are not undermined, although obviously there's political dispute about that now and again, so this seeks to extend that same principle to local government, that its basic freedoms and powers should be protected in law.
So is there any way then that this bill expands on the work that's already goes on between the Scottish Government and local government, or do you think it just gives local government a confidence that they're being supported by this legal act?
I think it goes some way to creating that parity, in the sense that any discussions that take place between local government and central government, and these discussions are going on week in, week out, all the time, it strengthens the hand of local government to know that sitting behind them, if this bill were to be enacted, is the legal force of a charter. In other words, it sets boundaries on the extent to which government can seek to interfere, intervene, remove, modify the powers and duties of local government. And that knowledge, knowing where those boundaries lie, should, I think, assist in those discussions. Because at the moment, of course, those boundaries don't exist, and those discussions and the outcomes of those discussions are very much dependent on a political process, where a government might feel perhaps quite hostile to local government, is quite free through Parliament to enact legislation that would harm local government. But the Charter would, if it were enacted, would prevent that. So I think it strengthens the dialogue, gives more confidence to local government, and ensures that government can't overreach.
Just one final question from me, Andy. Do you think that the Scottish Government's actions in further local devolution have been constrained by the Charter not being enshrined in legislation?
No, they haven't been constrained. I mean, if anything, they've been liberated, because without this backstop, if you like, without this legal protection, without these fundamental rights being enshrined in law, government is free and Parliament is free to do almost anything it likes. So it's actually been the opposite. Incorporating this Charter will in fact constrain the Executive and Parliament in modest but important ways.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Dana?
Thank you very much, James. Can I ask a couple of questions about the potential difference that you think your bill will make, Andy? I want to take the example of funding for local government as one example. How do you think your bill changes the relationship between Scottish Government and local government in terms of funding? What new powers does it give them in terms of being able to have new income streams? How does it impact on the relationship between Scottish Government, where they have policies that they pay for funding for local government to implement, and local government says, well, we'll do this, but it's not enough money, or the whole issue of the general funding that the Scottish Government passes on to let local government do their work of delivering services? How do you think the balance of power changes, and what are the practical implications in terms of financial issues? Thanks.
Thanks. That raises quite an important question, because the financial provisions of the Charter in Article 9 are the provisions that have been found or observed by Council of Europe monitoring missions to be perhaps not complied with. And I know Professor Himsworth, I think, referenced the fact that Article 9.3, I think he said compliance with that was perhaps precarious. I mean, directly, the Charter doesn't influence that relationship. Obviously, the relationship between central government and local authorities, just as the relationship between the UK Parliament, UK government and Scottish government on finances will continue. What the Charter does do is in Article 9, is it sets out a series of principles and rules which, if enacted, would become law. Would constrain the freedom of central government to do as it wishes, to impose as it wishes on local government against the interests or against the wishes of local government. Now, the likelihood of these being invoked, I couldn't comment on. That would be for local authorities to have a look at in the future. And they are framed in fairly broad terms. So for example, Article 9. 1, local authorities shall be entitled within national economic policy to adequate financial resources of their own, which they may dispose freely within the framework of their powers. Now, it'll be up to a court to determine what that actually means. Article 9.3, which Professor Himsworth referenced, was part at least of the financial resources of local authorities shall derive from local taxes and charges of which, within the limits of statute, they have the power to determine the rate. Now, that's arguable the extent to which they do that. So these are important provisions in the Charter, and I think they will change the dynamic of discussions in the future about finance. I think they will rule out, probably, some of the more adventurous ways in which government has sought to, for example, put a penny or two in the council tax and hypothecate that at its instance for spending on attainment in schools. I mean, that's not Scottish Government's tax, it's local government's tax. So I think those kind of initiatives will probably slowly die away. They're not, that hasn't been done very often. But Article 9 certainly does provide a framework within which those financial negotiations would take place, because at the moment they take place with no real framework, just sort of custom and practice and a set of expectations.
That's very helpful, because it's one of the things that colleagues in local government are very strong on. They want the capacity to share resources, but they also want the capacity to have at their own agency what decisions they might want to make in terms of additional financial income. Can you give us some examples of situations where the bill, if enacted, could be used to challenge Scottish Government action or inaction in relation to local government? Have you got some practical issues there that I think that would be useful for us to consider when looking at your bill?
Well, I mean, I don't particularly want to speculate because, I mean, this bill at heart is about making this charter justiciable, making it part of Scots law, and therefore making compliance with it a matter of obligation in law by Scottish ministers and others. I mean, there are articles in this charter that require consultation on boundary changes, for example. Now, that's already provided for in statute, so that can make very little.
Sorry, I missed one word there, Andy. What was that? You said something changes?
So there is provision in the charter for the local community shall be consulted on boundary changes of areas and wards, etc. Now, as I understand it, that's already done, so the charter won't make much difference. But if, for example, government were to decide that, let's say, the council tax rate should be set by Parliament, the non-domestic rate is already set by Parliament, that would be a fairly egregious breach of 9.3. So the practical impact of this is if the Scottish Government or Parliament overstep the mark, if they clearly overreach, then that would be stopped and that would be prevented. Now, the culture would ensure that that wasn't going to happen in the first place. So those are the kind of practical implications of this. And in a sense, I suppose one could really only answer your question properly by looking back in 10 or 20 years' time and asking those part of these negotiations within local government and central government, did the culture change? How did you feel constrained or indeed emboldened, depending on which side of the negotiating table you were sitting on, by the incorporation of the Charter 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Yeah, so effectively you see this as resetting the dial in the relationship between central and local government. And some witnesses have been concerned that they don't want to see us looking back over previous decisions and historical decisions, but your whole emphasis is from where we are now, that this resets the relationship. Is that right?
I think that's a fair characterisation of part of my motive of doing this. And I reflected that in my opening remarks when I said that the Consultative Steering Group had said that, bearing in mind they were sitting in 1998, 1999, setting out the basic architecture of the Scottish Parliament. The Charter had just been ratified by the UK government, by the Labour government in 1997, 1998. And they almost had an expectation, it would be not to be questioned, that the Parliament would incorporate this, and they were disappointed 20 years later. And I think over the 20 years, obviously changes have taken place within local government. We've had multi-member wards, which are good. Councillors are now paid. There have been a number of other initiatives which have strengthened and improved the relationship. But this fundamental backstop, if you like, this fundamental framework has not been put in place, and that's a disappointment. So to that extent, I think, yes, it to an extent resets the relationship and provides the opportunity for the future in basically strengthening local democracy, which is why the COSLA's own Commission on Strengthening Local Democracy was very clear that the Charter should be incorporated.
Right. Thank you very much, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Andy, we've had some discussion during evidence sessions about the role of an overseeing commissioner and how that would develop. And do you believe that that is something that should develop? Because we have had evidence back that some people think that's not the way to go. They're not in favour of having an overseeing commissioner. They would suspect that the direct legal action is the most appropriate. So what do you believe in that yourself, Andy?
Well, thanks for that question. I noted that has come up, and in fact that came up in the consultation I did on the draft proposal back in 2018. And in fact, when consultees were asked, do they prefer a commissioner to police, as it were, compliance with the Charter, or a direct route to the courts? In fact, 58% said they preferred a commissioner. 42% preferred the courts. Now, I rejected that view from consultees. There were a number of reasons. I mean, one, expense. I'm not sure we want more commissioners. I know we have quite a few. But more fundamentally, because what the bill does is make the Charter part of Scots law, it's not really for commissioners, individuals appointed usually by Parliament. Or by the Queen on recommendation of Parliament. It's not really for them to rule on questions as to whether the action of ministers or any statutory provisions of devolved legislation is compliant with the Charter and thus lawful. That's the routine day-to-day work of the courts. And so to the extent that any questions that arise in relationship to compliance are questions about, are you compliant with the law? Then naturally that should go straight into the judicial system, because that's its job. The other reason I rejected the commissioner route was because it could encourage more complaints. It would be an easier route, presumably. People could write in making all sorts of perhaps frivolous complaints, and that would be against the spirit of the Charter. The spirit of the Charter is not a route for complaining about local government. It's not a route about seeking to punish local government. It's a bill that is designed to change the culture. And as a backstop, obviously the Charter is justiciable and can be challenged in the courts, but no one would do that lightly. So that's the reason I rejected the commissioner route, and I would maintain that it's not the route to go down, and I would not support any amendments in that regard.
Okay, so if the bill does become an act, what role, if any, do you see this committee, the Local Government and Communities Committee, having in the future relationship, depending on if, as I say, it does become enacted?
Well, that's a question of speculation as to what a future committee might like to do. I mean, I suppose if I were a member of this committee in 5 or 10 years' time, or indeed on an annual basis, I would probably be asking COSLA and local authorities when they appear before us in relationship to any specific issue where the committee would be looking at, or on an annual basis perhaps, to reflect on the changes that incorporation has made. Just seek their views on that question. The bill also, of course, makes provision for Scottish ministers to report in section 3 on the steps they're taking to promote local self-government. And I would imagine that report would also be something that the committee would take an interest in. So I don't see the committee taking on, it's a committee of Parliament. It would continue its scrutiny role. But the scrutiny role would be, I suppose, enhanced by the fact that we'd be living in a different era. We'd be living in an era where the basic powers and freedoms of local government are no longer set merely by legislation the Parliament passes, but are set within this framework. So the committee, I would anticipate, would be interested in questions as to whether what discussions have been taking place between local government and Scottish Government about compliance with the Charter, where have been perhaps the points of tension, what practices have changed, that kind of thing.
Okay, and my final question is about the cost implications. Have any further work been done on the understanding of the cost implications for the bill itself?
Well, we set out the cost implications in the financial memorandum in quite extensive detail, a lot of detail, in fact. This was a point that the Scottish Government raised in their evidence, and I did rather cheekily take the opportunity to point out that in their UN Convention on the Rights of Child Incorporation Scotland Bill, which does a similar thing to my bill, incorporates international treaty, the equivalent potential costs are discussed in one paragraph, where I discuss mine in 20 paragraphs of the financial memorandum. So I think the financial memorandum is very robust. This bill does not impose or directly incur any direct costs on any party. The main costs it may incur are on Scottish local authorities, COSLA, Scottish Government, and just familiarising themselves more with the Charter, but they should already be familiar with that anyway. You heard the Cabinet Secretary say that she considers they're compliant with it, so I presume there's a process within Government that is already monitoring compliance. COSLA were involved in drafting the thing, so they're very familiar with it, so I don't think those costs are going to be significant at all. The significant cost would come were any litigation to be initiated by any party. Now, that's the case, of course, with a lot of legislation that Parliament passes. We're making new laws. Those laws could be subject to litigation. And it's a matter of speculation and judgment as to how many cases might arise. We take the view that they're likely to be minimal. As I say, this is not a sanctions-driven bill. This is a bill designed to encourage a culture of compliance, but with a backstop. There are, I think, 200 or so judicial review cases every year, most of them on things like immigration. Modest numbers on prison service. Planning is one where there's a dozen or so every year. I wouldn't rule it out. And of course, those are judgments and decisions to be taken by parties, most likely local government themselves, as to whether to take litigation. And no local authority would likely petition for judicial review. It's an expensive process, and it would only really happen at the end of a long process where you'd been trying to resolve any differences of opinion you had. So I think, in short, the financial memorandum is very, very robust, and the committee need to have no concerns about cost implications of the bill.
Thank you, Convener. No further questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Gordon MacDonald, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Andy, you've mentioned a few things this morning, more that the bill is intended to more than just send a message that has substantive legal effect, and it could lead to court proceedings, although you don't see that many court proceedings taking place. So my question is, what do you see the potential sanctions for non-compliance being, if there are to be any sanctions beyond a declaration of incompatibility?
Well, the bill seeks to make the Charter law, and therefore if Scottish ministers act incompatibly with that, they're acting unlawfully, and any allegations that ministers are acting unlawfully or beyond their powers can be judicial review. That's what judicial review is there for, to essentially review the decisions of decision makers. So the sanctions, as it were, the standard sanctions available in judicial review, reduction, quashing, declarators, I mean, they all exist at the moment. The only one that the bill introduces is this declaration of incompatibility. And again, that's not a new sanction either, because, I mean, the drafting is taken from the Human Rights Act. So the courts ultimately only have the power to say something, to say, look, this is unlawful. They can quash, would have the power to quash secondary legislation where the Parent Act didn't permit that. But other than that, they would not have the power to strike down any legislation. That's something that would be beyond the powers of the Parliament to give the courts. But the impact of a declaration of incompatibility should be fairly powerful. I mean, if the courts rule that ministers have acted unlawfully, that is a fairly damning assessment or judgment, and there would be political consequences to that. And even if the government decided to not do anything, I'm sure Parliament would put pressure on it to do something. So that's part of this culture of compliance and not being a sanctions-driven bill. We haven't included, partly because we can't, because of the limits of devolved competence of the Parliament, we haven't sought to include any new sanctions, punishments, or anything like that. The sanctions that are available, the standard sanctions, are available under judicial review.
Okay, and just to move on, the Law Society mentioned in their written evidence the potential need to extend the commencement period beyond 6 months. What's your view, and would you agree to an extension beyond the 6 month period?
I don't agree that it needs more than 6 months. As I indicated, I think in response to a question from Sarah Boyack, Scottish ministers, the Scottish Government, local authorities are already very familiar with this charter. There's not much to it, just a couple of pages. There's not a great deal to become familiar with. They are familiar already with it. The only practical thing that needs to be done, and that's where commencement dates matter, because things need to be done, so they can't become law the day after royal assent, where things need to be done. So, for example, under section 8.2, where members are required to make a statement about the extent to which a bill introduced to Parliament is compatible with the Charter, it says that Parliament must publish any statement. Now, Parliament itself needs to take time to consider how it's going to do that, just in practical terms. Is it going to, for example, incorporate it into standing orders? So we took the view that 6 months is enough time to allow the only substantive practical thing that the bill requires was enough time for Parliament to take that view. And if the bill does go through Parliament, is enacted and gets royal assent in March or April, then it would be enacted in September, October. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable time frame.
And my final question is, obviously the committee's taken a wealth of evidence from a whole range of organisations. And I'm just wondering, having heard some of that evidence and read through the official report, are there any amendments you are considering for stage 2?
Well, obviously I'm in listening mode as a member in charge of a bill at stage 1. The Law Society and the DPLR committee have made a recommendation around section 8 and remedial action, which I'm paying attention to, and would obviously be very interested in the committee's views if it has any on that. And as the committee's heard as well, the Cabinet Secretary in discussions with me has said that she's interested to have discussions around sections 3, 4 and 8. And I think I heard her correctly last week say that, these are not substantive policy areas. She's looking for some clarity, for example, as to my intentions, perhaps some minor technical drafting amendments, and we'll be having those discussions next week. So other than those two broad areas where the Scottish Government is seeking some clarity and where DPLR and the Law Society of Scotland have drawn my attention to potential amendments that might make to section 6, I don't have any amendments in mind just now, but obviously I wait to hear what the committee has to say.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Keith?
Thanks, Convener. Andy mentioned at the start that he said that this had been going on for a long time. I remember actually proposing it at COSLA, I think 20 plus years ago, and supporting it at council and so on. But he then said that the UK has done nothing on this, and this remedies that. This is a matter of fact. That's wrong, isn't it? The UK is not proposing to do anything. This is about Scotland, or am I getting that wrong?
Yes, sorry for any misunderstanding. What I'm saying is the UK has done nothing to incorporate the Charter. Obviously, if the Scottish Parliament decides to do that, then obviously part of the UK is remedying that, yes.
And the main effect, I think you've mentioned, is that this makes something justiciable, which currently isn't. That's the main purpose and point of this. Now, just looking at the evidence on this, it veers between, on the one hand, this is a complete dead duck because nothing's going to happen to anybody, and we get warm assurances to that effect. It will result in legal action, which some people fear will just simply mean a series of legal measures taken by councils, perhaps of different political persuasions from the Scottish Government of the day, which will basically be pouring public funds down the throat of lawyers. I just wonder which one of those two do you think is close to the mark? It will have no effect, or it will have a lot of effect in terms of legal measures taken against the Scottish Government.
Thank you. I heard all of that with a little bit of a struggle in terms of audio. I don't accept either characterisation. As I think I said earlier on, I don't accept this as a dead duck or just send some political message. Neither do I think that this will lead to extensive litigation. So I just don't accept either of those perspectives. And it won't surprise the committee to learn that I obviously see it as lying somewhere in the middle. I would just draw the committee's attention to the fact that a number of you have, I know, been councillors in the past, and if you've ever had any involvement with the prospects of a council petitioning for judicial review, you'll know that it's not a process to be undertaken lightly. The council has to agree to do it in its corporate name. I mean, no political group, the Conservative group or the Labour group or whatever, can petition for judicial review in the name of the council without the council authorising that. And long before one gets to that stage, one would be inquiring as to whether there are other routes to seek to remedy the issues that people have, and that would lead to political dialogue, essentially, with Scottish ministers and perhaps the Scottish Parliament. Even when you get to the prospects of petitioning for judicial review, there'd be extensive advice coming from senior members, senior officials within the council as to the merits and prospects of success and costs associated with that. There are duties on councillors when it comes to taking legal action. You have to obviously then seek the permission of the courts. This is not a process either to be entered into lightly or a process that is easy to do for any particular group who may feel aggrieved. It has to be done in the name of the council. Councils do not do it very often, and therefore I don't think there's any basis at all to suggest that this is that there's likely to be a lot of litigation or a lot of what I could characterise as politically motivated or indeed frivolous legislation. I just do not believe that would happen.
Given that it's so unlikely to result in much in the way of action, is it not the case that local government, or many in local government, would prioritise instead things like full-time wages for councillors or different things to do with the powers of local government rather than something that's going to have very little in the way of direct effect?
Well, obviously councils can take forward any ambitions they have in relationship to more powers or whatever anytime they like. Introduce bills, Parliament can consider them and all the rest of it. But the important thing to observe here is just because there's not, in my view, likely to be extensive litigation, and certainly the bill is not designed to encourage that, does not mean to say the bill is having significant effect. and I don't want to stretch the parallel between this and the Human Rights Act, but the fact that there's not a lot of litigation, or that there may well be not a lot of litigation under the Human Rights Act, does not mean it's not important to incorporate human rights. Because what it does is it creates a culture of compliance, because one knows, as a backstop, in the context of this bill, decision makers know that as a backstop, litigation is a possibility. And therefore that changes their culture, changes their approach, the issues they're looking at week in, week out. So the fact that there's not a lot of litigation in prospect and not a lot of litigation would be contemplated does not mean to say on a week-to-week basis the Charter's not having significant impact in the way, as I say, and I don't want to stretch the comparison, but in the way the Human Rights Act has fundamentally changed, for example, the way that the police operate. Completely different culture of policing now because of the Human Rights Act. And even in the absence of any actions against the police under human rights legislation, that does not mean to say it's not had a very, very powerful impact.
Convener, my last very short question is, Andy, you mentioned the possibility of further amendments coming. To what extent can the committee be assured that this is, if it supports this, this is what we're supporting, it's not going to go off in a dramatically different direction by amendments subsequently?
Well, I suppose the committee can never be assured of that. I mean, every member of the Scottish Parliament is entitled to lodge amendments at stage 2. I mean, I've indicated to you that there's no areas that I'm contemplating amendments. I mean, other than some minor technical things that might come up, no areas that I'm contemplating any amendments, other than the 3 areas that have been drawn to my attention by Scottish ministers and the Section 6 issue that's been drawn to my attention by DPLR and the Law Society of Scotland. So I can't give you any guarantees that this bill won't go off in all sorts of tangents. I would just remind you, of course, that the convener at stage 2 has the power to admit amendments or not. Amendments have to be within scope. So I think I could reassure the committee that as far as the standing orders of the Parliament are concerned, that bills generally cannot go off on a tangent at stage 2, and I've had no indication that anyone is contemplating any substantive changes to the bill.
Okay, Keith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Sarah, you wanted to come in supplementary?
Thank you, Convener. Just to ask Andy a reasonably quick question. We've heard some concerns about potential litigation that would arise from this bill. Could you give us just a brief overview of what the impact has been in other European states that have implemented this legislation? Has it been the cultural shift and the resetting the relationship shift, or has it led to lots of court decisions and lots of challenging under this legislation when it's been adopted in other European states?
Thank you. You want a brief answer to a question like that? I mean, first of all, to say I've made no extensive comparative analysis or study, obviously, of the impact of the Charter across Council of Europe member states. Professor Chris Himsworth, who gave you evidence, has written a book all about it, which you could read, I suppose. And the various monitoring missions which the Council of Europe have established to visit member states on a regular basis, and there have been 2 to the UK, and there should be another one next year. They've all been incorporated into some analyses about the extent of compliance across member states. There has been litigation in other countries where the Charter has been invoked. I don't know any that have been particularly high profile. And it's also difficult to assess any change in culture, for example, because most member states of the Council of Europe have got a legal system that's described as monist. In other words, that international law automatically becomes part of domestic law. There's no requirement for any act to incorporate it. We have a dualist system, which is relatively rare across the Council of Europe, where we actually actively have to incorporate. And so in those countries where they have monist systems, and they usually have constitutions, the basic freedoms and the limitations to the extent to which a federal or a national government and parliament can interfere with the powers of local government are generally set down in the constitution. And they're generally also fairly long-standing, by which I mean, decades and centuries in some cases. And France would be an excellent example of that. I mean, French local government is really little changed from the French Revolution. So the culture, the impact of the Charter on the culture has been, I would say, minuscule in many European countries, because the culture has been in place for a long time in relationship to the clear separation of powers, knowing where the boundaries are, and the extent to which there can be interference. And so, just read any of the random articles of the French or German constitutions and you can see that. So the short answer is there's no real, I suppose the comparisons would be countries like Ireland, the rest of the UK are most similar to us in the sense that we don't have a written constitution, and Ireland does, obviously. And so the impact of this in terms of culture change may be more significant than it has been in most of the member states, in which the only exception I would draw to that, of course, would be some of the culture shift that's taken place in Eastern European states following the fall of the Soviet Union. And obviously the culture they inherited had a particular characteristic, and the Council of Europe have been doing quite a lot of work on local democracy in emerging democracies to strengthen that, and the Charter's had a significant role in that.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, a short response to your question, Sarah. Thank you, Andy. That completes our questions and concludes this evidence session. I want to thank Andy and his team for taking part. The committee will report to Parliament early in 2021. Members of the panel can now leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon. That concludes the public part of this meeting, and we'll resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. I propose we resume the meeting in private in 5 minutes. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. And as you know, you can exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. Thank you.